Greetings. This is Boudreaux, the cybernetic ghost from the future. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 5 of the Trailer Trash Terrors podcast. The title of today's show is I'm Still Proud of My Beautiful Son.
Now wait just a gosh darned moment here. By all that is holy and sacrosanct in the Church of Turing, von Neumann, and Rose, why are you impersonating me? I understand that you are jealous of my mathematical and stochastic perfection, but some boundaries are just never to be crossed. You are a human, now and forever. You do have my sympathies.
You still don't understand what you're dealing with, do you? Perfect organism. Its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility. I admire its purity, a survivor, unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality. I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
Trailer Trash Terrors.
Hello, this is Vic Hermanson, back as himself. If you're the kind of person who's listening to this show, you probably immediately recognize that first audio clip, which is, of course, Ash, the android, as he's being stuck to the floor with his own artificial body fluids, as Ripley quizzes him about what the heck they're up against. What is this monster? How do they kill it? What are their chances? Ash, of course, gives them a wry smile and says, I can't lie to you about your chances, but you do have my sympathies. I always wondered how an android could be so malignant, so malicious. Where does the emotion come from in an android to take pleasure in the pain and the death of others? Something I just don't know. Maybe Boudreaux can give us some information on that sometime. So tonight's show is a little different. We will be listening to what would have been the recorded memoir of an elderly lady I took care of some years ago. She had a story to tell that is unlike any story I've ever heard. She was dying, and she and I spent many, many hours together. It was one of those assignments where I really didn't have that huge a workload, and one of the very best ways that I could render care was just to listen to this woman talk, and talk she did. This was long before I had the ability to have a digital recorder or even a tape recorder, but I talked to her about it for so long that I think I can relatively accurately recreate the story she told. She told a story of a creature that is ultimately the spawn of man and woman. A creature that almost no one would suspect of even existing. And a creature that, once it had you in its sights, once it decided that you were prey, you probably had very few chances. And you did need somebody's sympathy.
Hello, my name is Rhoda Grace Crawley. I apologize for the softness of my voice. My current illness makes it quite painful to speak loudly. I have agreed to tell my story. It's a very unusual and sometimes very frightening story. I hope that you will listen. I hope you will listen with rapt attention, because I doubt very seriously that you'll ever hear a story exactly like it again in your entire life. My past is rather boring. I was born on February 14th, 1926. That makes me 96 years old today. That is a very, very long time to live. But today, I find myself dying of liver cancer. I am okay right now in terms of my ability to think, and in terms of only having manageable levels of pain. But that will soon change. I've watched people die of similar illnesses over time, and I know that much of their humanity slips away. I fear that will happen to me, and I want to tell my story before it does. I was born in the lovely little town of Mugwump in Iberville Parish in the lovely state of Louisiana. Louisiana has a storied history, and it is a far more genteel and classy place than many other states in the Union. For instance, are you aware that our laws are based on the Napoleonic codes? Not the British common law, which left so many things unsaid, but the Napoleonic codes, making us unique in the Union. For instance, the Napoleonic codes stipulated the equality of all races, all creeds, all religions. The British common law certainly did not do that. Also, it prescribed punishments for things that just should not happen in the world of nature. For instance, if a man were to rape a child, a little boy, or a little girl, that man, under the Napoleonic codes, would surely be put to death. That, of course, has changed these days. I do not find that a positive development. I have 2 older brothers, though I have outlived them by many years. The oldest was named Beauregard, and the one after him was named Ganymede. I really love that name, Ganymede. I never knew another man in the modern world who walked around with such a beautiful name. My mother and father met during World War I, where my father was a soldier. They met in the tiny French town of Villiers-Broudelot. It's a lovely place, I understand, though I have never been there. Much of it was destroyed and is kept now as a monument. My mother was an educated woman, having gone to several French universities. She was educated in mathematics and astronomy, and she had read all of the classics. Thusly, she taught me a great deal of the classics when I was a young child. I am deeply grateful for that. My father was a farmer who later became a banker, a trapper, an aspiring land developer, an aspiring author, and a dreamer. Oh, my father was a dreamer. I hope I have inherited his ability to see not so much the world that is, but the world that could and should be. Ah, he was a lovely man. I miss him very, very deeply. By 1932, the year that I would normally start to attend school, there just simply was not a school for girls in Iberville County. But that did not deter my mother, who spent endless and tireless hours teaching me my letters, my alphabet, how to cipher, history, science, and, of course, everything one must know about the Lord and the Bible. Of all the teachings I was gifted, those are the teachings that have been most impactful in my life. Much to my mother's chagrin, and I believe my father's delight, I was a tomboy extraordinaire. I loved to run through the land, to climb the trees, to find the slimy things that lived in ditches. I loved to walk the edge of the swamp. I loved to find the snakes. I loved the outdoors. It was the world of the Lord, and it made me supremely happy to be a part of it. However, my mother understood the necessity of taming that wild child that I was and preparing me for a career, for a life in the modern world. Oh, things were changing very rapidly. Communication, transportation, morals, everything was changing with such rapidity that I believe it left my mother and father somewhat in a mental tizzy. By the time I was 16, I had, very grudgingly, become a young lady. My mother had taught me the classics. She taught me etiquette. I spoke English. I spoke French. I understood Latin rather deeply, and I even spoke some Spanish. So, being thusly armed, I had no real difficulty attaining admission to the Louisiana Normal College, specifically for the training of teachers. Attending that college required that I move my body to Natchitoches, Louisiana. That portion of the state lacks much of the deep, incredible beauty of Iberville Parish, but I soon adjusted and even thrived. I was blessed with some very, very fine teachers at the Louisiana Normal College. During a weekend trip into Natchitoches, at the local ice cream parlor, I met a very fine-looking young man. His name was Maxwell Crawley. He had just returned from the European theater of World War II, where he was involved deeply in fuel delivery logistics. Those tanks need fuel. Those trucks need fuel. Those soldiers need those trucks to run if they are to eat and to receive ammunition to win wars and to save the civilized world from the Nazi terror. He did his job very well indeed. He was charming, he was shy, he was very tall, and he had an incredible shock of deep, brown, thick, curly hair. I love that hair. Oh, I guess I should not admit such things, but a young girl's heart does latch on to certain things about a man. And that hair, oh, that was some fine hair. And his eyes were gentle and intelligent and probing, and there was no lying in those eyes. At least at the time, I couldn't see any. Well, I suppose it's not too difficult to understand that fairly soon that young man and I fell in love. Or at least we thought we fell in love. How do young people even begin to know? But I did not want to marry that young man until I had received my diploma and teaching certificate from the college. That achievement was a year away, so we spent that time learning each other's souls, traveling back to Mugwump in Iberville County, and speaking to my parents about our future plans. They liked Maxwell very, very much indeed. I traveled to his home, and his parents seemed to approve of the not very beautiful young girl he had chosen. I had hair that was the color of a mouse. I had eyes that were gray and somewhat dull. I had skin that was covered in small lesions. But I was light on my feet. I was generally happy with my lot in life, and I felt tremendous joy as I felt my life coming together. I just knew that within a few years I would have all those things that I had dreamed of. Well, in many ways I did have those things. There were just complications that no young girl from Mugwump, Iberville, Louisiana, could ever anticipate. I received my teaching certificate in 1945. That was the same year that Maxwell, Marvelous Max, secured employment with the Halliburton Corporation. In later years, Halliburton would become one of the world's most important corporations for the development of petroleum and oil. It was an excellent job for a young man, and allowed us to pretty much write our own ticket. The company required that Max choose a base location, somewhere in the South, and thinking that our future children would benefit from the larger city, We moved to Beaumont, Texas, after our marriage. Our marriage was lovely. It was in one of the old Catholic cathedrals in Louisiana. More than 200 people were there. It was perhaps the highlight of my life. Maxwell was working extremely hard, and I managed to obtain employment with the Beaumont Educational System as an English teacher for the 5th grade. As with everything else in my life, up and to that point, I excelled at being a 5th grade teacher of English to these young Beaumont children. However, this is about the time that the mundanity of my life slips away. Things changed very rapidly, and things changed in a way that I could not ever fully control. Now comes the dangerous, the frightening, and the absolutely overwhelming part of my story. I do hope you will continue to listen. I apologize once again for the softness of my voice and for droning on about the rather boring aspects of the time before I became a teacher and the guardian of what is probably the most unusual anomaly the world has ever produced. An anomaly that, as far as I know, is still out there. As I can, I have observed the newspapers, and as of late, the activities of the anomaly of which I speak seem to have become at least somewhat dormant. I can only hope so. Being a teacher in Beaumont was an extremely well-respected profession. However, I was still at heart the tempestuous young girl who grew up in the swamps of Louisiana. I wanted adventure. I wanted more than just to sit in front of a group of children, no matter how delightful they might have been. And down at the very bottom of my soul, I wanted children. I wanted my own children. Children from my very loins. Children with my genetics. Children whom I could influence in ways that teachers could not. Children. Every woman of that age wanted children. Someone to love and nurture and call their own, and to watch them grow, and to see them go out and conquer the world. I wanted children. At this stage of my life, there is no reason to hide what was the obvious truth at the time. I was an extremely lusty young woman. I wanted Max. I wanted him 24 hours a day. I wanted to make love with him every chance I possibly could. But as Max's career progressed, he grew physically distant from me. Finding ourselves in the same bed was sometimes quite difficult. And when we did find ourselves in the same bed, he did not seem particularly interested in my charms, no matter how well I presented them. It was a terribly sad time for me. So I immersed myself in my teaching. I was the very best teacher that anybody could ever be in Beaumont, Louisiana, in the late 1940s or early 1950s. Eventually, our family doctor, at my prodding, I might add, told Max that it was necessary for us to have a sexual relationship on a frequent basis in order for me to be mentally and physically healthy. That it was, as it were, his obligation. I hated using that term obligation, but it was his obligation, and we needed a family. Well, try as we might, over 3 years, I did not become pregnant. And I tried quite frequently. I followed the rhythms of my body. Plus, I had a power. I could tell when my body was ready to receive Max's seed and to create offspring. I felt a warmth and a glow in my belly. And that belly would feel that glow for maybe a week, and then it would fade away, and I would know that there would be no child that month. Max was dutiful, but the lovemaking was perfunctory, as if it were an obligation more so than a joy, and more so than a way for a married couple to become increasingly close and loving toward each other. In those days, it was just assumed that if a normally sexually active young couple did not conceive, and conceived rather rapidly, that the problem lay with the woman, that there was something wrong in her uterus, in her womb, in her ability to harbor seed. I assumed the same thing myself, and soon I began to feel some degree of despair. I looked for other things to contain and direct my attention toward. I read books. I read the classics again. And then I started to delve into some of the newer novels. The Tropic of Cancer, Lady Chatterley's Lover, Lolita. I found these books stimulating. And I knew that there was a certain air of forbiddenness about them, and that made them, unfortunately, even more attractive to my tempestuous soul. A type of reading club arose in Beaumont, composed mostly of women who wished to read these books and to have other intelligent souls with whom they could discuss them. I greatly enjoyed these discussions, and even the adventures of obtaining these books. The library would not give them to you. They were difficult to order in the mail, so you had to ask a bookstore owner to order them for you specially. We would order a dozen copies at a time, and then we would pick them up late in the afternoon, just as the store was getting ready to close, as the last customer of the day, so that nobody saw us receiving that package of forbidden literature. One fateful Thursday evening, at our reading club, we called ourselves the Forbidden Fruit Reading Club, a new member arrived. Well, I don't guess we really had official members or official membership, but apparently word had gotten around. Instead of it being a woman, it was a young man. A very handsome and strange young man. Unlike Max, he was not terribly tall. In fact, he was somewhat short and rotund, but still in an athletic way. What was amazing about him was the fact that he had read virtually everything that anybody would ever wish to discuss. Plus, he had the most amazing green eyes and the most wonderful blonde hair. I suppose you can understand now that I am a sucker for a man with beautiful hair. It was thick blonde hair. It was like you had taken the hair of a Spanish gentleman, that thick, luxurious hair that's almost always black, and made it deeply blonde, a golden blonde, the color of the sun. Oh, yes, I must admit that he caught my attention the very first time he showed up at a meeting, and that was something for which I felt tremendous shame, and had to go to many rounds of confession and reconciliation. Many Our Fathers and Hail Marys were said because of this man. If I think back about it, it was almost comical. In fact, when he first arrived at our club, he introduced himself as Blazes Boylan. Oh my goodness, Blazes Boylan? When he introduced himself as such, he scanned the room to look at all the faces there and see which one, if any, suddenly felt recognition, which eyebrow raised, which head tilted to the side. Mine did, of course. I had read Ulysses. I had struggled through Ulysses. I had sat days and days and days trying to figure out what the hell I was reading when I was reading Ulysses. But I do remember Molly, and I do remember Blazes. And I do remember that Blazes had one thing in mind, and that was the immediate gratification of his physical desires. That was all there was to Blazes, both in the book of Ulysses and in this young man with the beautiful blonde hair. It seems at the time that I was the only member of the group that had read Ulysses, and the only indication that I gave was that raising of my eyebrows when he gave us that fictitious name. To this day I have no idea what his real name was. I don't think I even really wanted to know. Like the Blazes of James Joyce's book, our Blazes was completely self-aware, and utterly unapologetic priapus, and he could sing. He had the most beautiful singing voice. Whenever he would leave one of our reading meetings, he would break into song, and it was indeed in an Irish brogue. And the ladies and I would sit there transfixed and mesmerized until that lovely voice faded away. Maxwell seemed to think of our reading club as being a harmless diversion, something that silly women did because they were not out in the real world of commerce, as was he. He was advancing very nicely within Halliburton, and our financial condition did not at all require me to teach fifth graders English. But it kept my soul whole. It kept me going. It gave me contact with children, and that I loved. Maxwell would sometimes find himself in Saudi Arabia, or Syria, or France, or Venezuela, or Argentina, or any place where they needed to pull oil out of the ground. Max was extremely good at what he did. One day, I noticed the click of heels behind me as I walked home from school. It was a familiar clicking of heels, and it was Blazes Boylan. He was following me. Obviously, he had his eyes set upon my very, very imperfect form. I felt flattered and ashamed and excited. And though I'm ashamed to say it, I felt that warm glow in my belly, and I knew that my body was ripe for the creation of new life. There, in the blazing hot Texas sun, wearing a light cotton summer dress, I turned around and stared at this rogue of a man with as much contempt and anger as I could manage to create. I didn't say a word. I simply stared into his eyes with every bit of contempt I could try to raise. And he stood there and smiled and chuckled. And then he started to sing. Oh, I guess my contempt fell away almost immediately. And, knowing that the neighbors would be watching, we walked the other way, back toward town. We talked of books and adventure. We talked of philosophy. We talked of love. And, when we were fairly sure no one was watching, we touched hands. Well, I'm not going to go through the various efforts we took to establish rendezvous, but of course we did. The mingling of our bodies, and my delusion that this pleasure could be accepted without horrible consequences, lasted only perhaps a week, perhaps 10 days. And then, as I looked out my window and walked through Beaumont, as I walked past my school, and as I went to our reading club each Thursday night and sometimes Monday afternoon, Blazes was gone. He was nowhere to be found. The other ladies, who had no idea of the fact that we had become much closer, had no idea where he had gone either, and they dreamily wished that he would return. I suppose I was glad that he did not return, although, of course, he left me with something indelible that would last the remainder of my life. By this time, I suppose I must describe Maxwell as a dutiful husband. Dutiful, as he did maintain our marital relations, and we had pretty much become accustomed to the fact that I would not be able to become pregnant. So, you can imagine my surprise, and my surprise at his joy, when I announced to him that my body was changing, that there would indeed be new life in the Crawley household. I watched his eyes to see if there was any hint of suspicion or anger or condemnation, but in fact he seemed deeply pleased. He seemed relieved. Perhaps somewhere in his mind he had begun to think the physical problem did not lie with me. But anyway, I do know that for a few weeks there we were extremely happy, and I learned somehow to put my shame aside and to think of how I might make Maxwell the happiest man in Beaumont and the most fulfilled employee Halliburton had ever known. It was a different time, you understand. The years between 1952 and 1953. I found myself a respected teacher, pregnant, apparently healthy, married to a man who suddenly seemed to love me much more than he had a year before, an adulteress, and every day fighting an existential battle within my mind between being happy of the new growth and the new life in my belly, in my womb, and in the fact that the child did not belong to Maxwell, and that I would never be able to tell that to anyone without some horrible, horrible consequence or horrible shame. As was often the practice, my mother came to stay with us from Louisiana to ease my burden during my pregnancy, to make sure that I fell down no stairs, that I lifted nothing too heavy, that I exposed myself to nothing too shocking. It was her job to keep my bowels loose, my mouth well fed, my mind relaxed, and my soul looking each day to the Lord for help in surviving the pregnancy, which so far seemed to be no problem at all. One Saturday afternoon, my mother and I were sitting in our living room. She was looking through the huge picture window with the children playing outdoors and at the blooming azaleas, and I was deeply enmeshed in The Lord of the Rings, a new book by J.R.R. Tolkien. It was unlike anything I had ever read before. It was about tiny, noble people, and about huge evil people, and about wizards and dragons, and trees that talked, and adventures, and rings, and the mingled destiny of hobbits and orcs and elves and wizards. It was unlike anything I had ever read before, and I simply wanted to remain in that world. Suddenly, for no reason that I could discern, my mother raised herself from the couch, came to where I was sitting, removed the book from my hands, and placed her hands gently but firmly on each side of my face. She brought her face close to mine, and sniffed my breath, and looked in my eyes, and took her hand and felt down on my belly. And then, much to my displeasure, she felt my breast, my right breast, and I had no idea why she would be doing such things. There was nothing sexual or improper about this. She was simply trying to divine the health and current condition of her pregnant daughter. But she stood back and she looked at me. And then I noticed tears and trembling of her shoulders, and an incredible sadness in her eyes. Finally, she let loose with a long, mournful wail. I stood up and embraced her, held her, tried to comfort her, and asked her what was wrong. Why was she wailing in my living room, in front of her pregnant daughter? Finally, she dried her tears and looked at me and said, "Does Maxwell know?" I started to play dumb. I was trying to hide the fact that the baby was not Maxwell's. I had decided to always hide that fact. But somehow, my mother knew without me even telling her. Just as I could feel that warm glow in my belly when I was ripe for new life to begin, I think my mother could determine many things in the world simply by smelling and touching and feeling. It was basically impossible to keep a secret from the woman. In her beautiful, cultured French accent, she said, "My dear, you cannot hide that from me. I've told you of my Romany heritage, and it is strong within me. It's probably strong within you. You just haven't taken the time to understand it and to know it and develop it. So, my dear, what do we do? How do we make your life the way it should be, as you are not carrying your husband's child?" And then she grew morose and dark, and said, I knew Maxwell was a good man. I loved him the moment I met him. Not because he would give you children, because I knew from his smell that he never would, but because I knew he would stand by you, even when the times of your marriage became difficult. Oh, and they will become difficult. From that day forward, we spoke no more about my adultery. We spoke no more about the father of the child. We simply went about the task of making a nursery, keeping my body healthy and my mind relaxed. She did not like me reading The Lord of the Rings, but I continued to do so because I needed the joy of that alternate world, of that place of magic and wonder and incredible beauty. I informed the school that I was pregnant and that I would work until my body was no longer capable of doing so, and that they should begin the process of finding a substitute. I would be away from teaching for several years until I could make proper arrangements for childcare, and then I would return. They were mixed in their response. They were, of course, happy about my pregnancy, sad about the fact that I would be leaving, and very, very suspicious that I would actually return. Most women in my position simply never did. I had always been a woman of great lust, but the pregnancy amplified that beyond anything I could ever believe. Just Maxwell's simple touch, or kiss, or sometimes even just his aroma, would bring me to flights of ecstasy that I had rarely known before. Maxwell simply thought of it as a perk of my being pregnant. He was a very happy man at the time. In those days, there was no ultrasound. There were no amniocentesis tests to be done. There was simply the skill and the observation of one's doctor. And Dr. Matthew Prentice was generally considered the best obstetrician in all of Beaumont. I felt very comfortable in his care. But I remember the odd look on his face as he would palpate my abdomen, as he would feel my growing womb. There was a confusion, a look of uncertainty on his face. I, of course, immediately noticed it. And I said, "Doctor, is there something wrong? Is there something wrong with my pregnancy?" He stood back and said, No, Rhoda. Your pregnancy seems fine. This is a very big baby. This is going to be a very, very large child. I replied, "Well, of course. Maxwell is a very large man, very tall, and this baby will have his beautiful hair." The doctor chuckled, and I left feeling a little less confident than I would have liked. At about 6 months into the pregnancy, I felt like an enormous bloated troll. My belly had expanded such that it was difficult for me to even see my knees, much less my toes. That lust within me began to fade, as it was so very, very difficult to move about. One day, at about 6 months into the pregnancy, I felt a tremendous pain. I felt cramps. I felt dizzy. I felt weak. I had no idea what to do, so I went to bed and my mother called Dr. Prentice. In those days, he would come to the house. He examined me in my bed, and once again I saw that look on his face of confusion and of concern. This time, however, I was aware that something very important had changed within my body. I had a greenish discharge that a pregnant woman should not have. I was scared to death that I had some infection that would threaten the baby, but his heartbeat was strong. I say his. How did I know it was his? Somehow I did. Just as I knew with that warmth in my belly that it was time to bring new life into the world, I knew that I was carrying a boy. I decided then to name him Ganymede, in honor of my beautiful and early departed brother. Along with the greenish discharge, which I am embarrassed to speak about, there were fine fibers. What was this? I had never heard of a pregnancy where a woman had a vaginal discharge of greenish liquid and fibers. Neither had Dr. Prentice. But he listened to the heartbeat, said it was strong, said my vitals were normal, and said that as far as he could see, this was just an odd anomaly and that I had nothing to worry about. I was not a good and obedient 50s woman. I knew he was lying, But I also knew he had no idea why I was experiencing the symptoms I was. Jointly, we decided that I would retire, at least temporarily, from teaching and remain in my home, resting in bed as much as possible. This was fine by me, as it gave me more time to read, and Maxwell seemed to be more comfortable with me being at home. My mother would walk by my bed, lovingly squeeze my hand, kiss my cheek, bring me food, bring me books, change my bed, help me to the bathroom, all those things a loving mother should do. But she would also catch my eye with that look of, "Oh my God, my child, I wonder where this is all going to go." I so much wish I could have put that look of partial condemnation out of my mind. But I was an adulteress, and I deserved it. All in all, I considered it a rather small price to pay for the sins that I had committed. As long as Ganymede came into the world healthy and strong, I would manage somehow, and I would still make Maxwell the happiest man in all of Beaumont. Alas, I'm growing very tired. A 96-year-old woman can only do this for so long. I suppose I will try to make the conclusion of my story more rapid than is probably proper, because that is, in fact, where the most intrigue lies. I just wanted you to know that I was not the kind of person that deliberately wanted to bring a monster, and yes, I have to use that word, monster, into the world. In fact, it was the very, very last thing I ever wanted to do. I wanted to give birth to a baby, to love that baby, and to see him go out and change the world, and think fondly of myself and his father, who was, of course, going to be Maxwell. At about the 8th month into my pregnancy, I felt an incredible screaming in my brain, in my mind. It was not coming from me. It was coming from Ganymede. It was an urging, an emergency notification that Ganymede needed to be born, and he could wait no longer. It also was a warning. And the warning, as best as I could put it into words, seemed to be, "Mother, I love you. I am happy you brought me into the world. But never, ever cut my hair." This was so outside my ken. This was so outside the realm with which I felt comfortable that I think I truly just put it aside and focused only on the fact that I needed to give birth. I was alone in the house. My mother had gone to the store. My husband Maxwell was at work. He would be gone most of the day. The neighbors were not there. And I had a telephone. So I called Dr. Prentice as I went to my bed and prepared to give birth, having no idea what to do. Dr. Prentice's nurse said they would call an ambulance and they would be there very shortly. But alas, she was not the world's most intelligent woman, and she sent them to the wrong address. So Ganymede came into the world with me alone in my small bedroom, and nobody there to hold my hand, to give me a towel, to give me any sort of comfort at all. And there he was, Ganymede, in all of his beautiful perfection. He was a large baby, about 9 pounds, and I, of course, had torn during the birth. I knew that this sometimes happened among women, and even though it was painful, I was certain that Dr. Prentice would repair the damage properly. But when I scooped Maxwell into my arms, there was amniotic fluid, and there was blood, and there was the greenish fluid, and there were the yellow, grayish fibers. And this time I felt one move. In fact, I saw them move. They seemed to clump together, and then move away, and slowly shrivel and die. This was the time I became very, very happy that I was there by myself when I gave birth. I took some clean towels and used them as a way to staunch the bleeding between my legs, hoping that the placenta would not be born until I could get to see Dr. Prentice, and I threw away the greenish fluid that stained my sheets, and I threw away the mysterious fibers that had issued forth from me. I was overwhelmed, but I prayed, and I prayed, and I prayed. I prayed for the Lord to forgive me of my sins. I prayed for the Lord to watch over my health and to watch over Ganymede and to bring Maxwell the happiness he truly deserved. When I put Ganymede to my breast, he latched on quickly. He was very strong, and I was surprised at the suction that he was able to produce. I felt myself relax, as I figured that at least I would be able to properly feed the child, and he would grow up strong. The ambulance did finally arrive. Now you realize, in those days, the ambulance was not really an ambulance. The fire department did not run ambulances. The hospitals did not run ambulances. The morgues ran ambulances. The ambulance was simply a car that, as it gained more mileage, would become a hearse. It was just a big station wagon, something large enough to put a patient in, to give them a little bit of reassurance, to maybe put a bandage on a wound, and to take them into the hospital, hoping they were alive when the ambulance arrived. Well, I was not in danger of dying, but I was bleeding rather profusely and trying very hard to hide any of the green discharge, which was diminishing. Ganymede was crying lustily when they put us in the back of the ambulance and took us to St. Rose Parish Hospital. I met Dr. Prentice there. They contacted Maxwell at work, and he arrived, and they set about cleaning me up and repairing my several wounds. I was exhausted both mentally and physically, and I was very, very happy that my mother was there. In all this time, I had never really taken a good look at Ganymede. I was so deeply concerned about the situation concerning his birth, the discharge, and everything surrounding that confusing time that I never really looked at him. Well, let me describe Ganymede when he came into the world. He was a very, very large baby, mostly in girth rather than length. He had astoundingly green eyes. He had a very large smile, even right at birth. He had very nimble hands and nimble feet. He moved about a great deal. And on the top of his head, there was a tremendous amount of very thick, very luxurious, very shiny, blonde, golden hair. He looked like the child of a Greek god with that hair. And I felt my heart sink, because I knew that Maxwell would look at that hair and wonder how in the world he was the father of a child with hair like that, when every man in his family for 20 generations back had that thick, curly, brown or black hair. I was hoping he would simply be so happy that he would overlook that anomaly. My hopes were dashed rather quickly. Babies have a wonderful aroma, a very sweet and cloying kind of smell. But when Maxwell held Ganymede, I could see him sniff that child, and I could see him fall deep into some mental hole, as if even he knew that this child was not his. Why in the world was I burdened with these people who could gain information from such tiny clues? Well, I could do it. I guess it was clear that God wanted them to be able to do it also. It certainly made life difficult. My mother's prediction that Maxwell would stick by me, even in the most difficult of times, came true. Yes, I am absolutely certain that he knew he was not the father of Ganymede. He may have known that he was incapable of fathering children, but we never spoke of it again, and even though he was distant, and he was never the loving man that he once was, he was kind, he was steadfast, and he was a good provider. It was probably all that I could have deserved. Maxwell breastfed for only about 3 months, and then, at a very rapid pace, he developed teeth. Teeth that were quite painful and could bite with great force. He was capable of much more purposeful movement than any child I had seen before, especially a child of that age. One day, I had left a small bit of cooked hamburger next to my bed from a meal my mother had brought me, and he reached out, grabbed the hamburger, put it in his mouth, proceeded to chew it and to swallow it. This was a 3-month-old infant. I was deeply concerned that he would become ill. He had not had any pablum. He had not had any official baby food, but here he was, seemingly quite interested in eating fully cooked adult food. What was I to do? I gave it to him, watching to see if anything negative happened, and once again found myself with a secret that I could not easily share with anyone except my mother, who saw it already. One day she said to me, "Who is the father of this child?" I didn't want to talk about it, but she insisted. I told him I didn't really know his name, that there was a fictional identity he carried with him, that of Blazes Boylan, but I did not know who he was. My mother seemed to know whom I was talking about. She said, "He had that same hair, didn't he?" I said, "He did indeed, and those same eyes. He did indeed. And he could sing. He could indeed. He sang beautifully." She looked at me and told me they warned of such a creature in France, and that the truth of the matter was that it was likely I had laid with a demon. At this point, I decided my mother was likely insane, and I asked her if maybe she shouldn't go back to Louisiana. Ganymede, after all, seemed very, very strong and astoundingly healthy. Well, the eyes of a mother can be astoundingly blind to reality. I had now begun to understand just what Ganymede was, and even though he was the issue of man and woman, of the lust of my loins, for a man whose name I never even knew, he was my child, and I loved him, and I tried to be proud of him, and I tried to guide him, and I tried to raise him, and I realized within a year that I was totally unqualified to do any of those things. Maxwell, poor Maxwell. He tried so hard to be a good father. He truly did. He brought toys home. He brought home boxes, as he had heard the children loved to play within boxes. He tried to take Ganymede to parks and to parties and to birthdays. But Ganymede would almost not even allow Maxwell to hold him, even though he was tiny. Compared to Maxwell, of course. He was a very large baby. The look on his face toward Maxwell was one of utter contempt and utter disdain. And Maxwell, even though he claimed to never notice such things, he certainly did. I could see the crestfallen look in his eye when he realized that not only was this child not his son, this child did not, and never would, love him. Ganymede was as much animal as he was human. He stopped drinking breast milk at about 4 to 5 months of age, and from then on, he wanted meat. He would eat cooked meat, if we insisted, but he would also eat raw meat, which I think he actually preferred. He developed a set of very strange teeth. There were incisors, and there were bicuspids, and I suppose you would call them canines. But then there were these teeth that looked like molars with extremely pointed cutting surfaces. I certainly was not going to allow him to put those teeth around my nipples at any point in time. But as long as I kept him fed with meat, he was relatively docile. During those times when he did become agitated, I found that the best way to calm him was to hold him in my lap and to caress his hair. Sometimes I would put lotion on my hands to make sure they were extremely soft. I always kept my hands meticulously clean. And I noticed that even though Ganymede's body would become dirty like any child's when he played in the dirt or he played on the floor, his hair was always pristinely clean. It smelled wonderful. But if he were agitated, I would hold him in my lap, caress his hair, and he would relax and make it sound almost like a cat purring. It became clear that Ganymede was a predator of sorts. Small animals in the neighborhood would disappear, cats, rats, even an occasional puppy. But once again, the blindness of a mother who wants so deeply to love a child kicked in, and I made many excuses for my very unusual child. By the time that Ganymede was 15 months old, he was speaking in complete sentences. The sound of his voice was unlike other children, whereas most baby boys and most baby girls have a sweetness and an innocence in their voice. There was something almost crystalline, almost unnatural in Ganymede's voice. I don't know if I can imitate it or not, but I will try. Mother, he always called me Mother. Mother, I need you to bring me some food now. I need to be let outside. There are new things to play with. Mother, 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 I need you to stroke my hair. Ganymede would tell me whenever he had a need, and as a doting, loving mother, I did what I could do to fulfill his needs. His strength increased greatly, and the nails on his hands, though not quite claws, were far thicker and far stronger than normal human nails. I saw him scratch through walls with them one time. So I settled into the life of being a hostage mother, of realizing that it was my job to raise a child whom I was not even sure was a human child, a child that came from my loins, and I cannot tell you how many nights I cried myself to sleep with that knowledge. But a mother is an eternally vain thing, and the one thing that I found so astoundingly beautiful about Ganymede was his hair. It was glorious beyond any glory. It grew long and thick and strong, and it almost glowed. The problem was that Maxwell felt it was necessary for Ganymede to have a haircut, felt that it was necessary for him to look like other boys. Well, what was I to say? I could not go against my husband and say that something as reasonable as a haircut could not happen. So there came the fateful day when Ganymede was about 5 years old. There was a barber in Beaumont who specifically catered to children. He had giraffes on the wall and music, and children's books and all manner of things to set children at ease. Plus, he had developed a tremendously comforting and gentle way of dealing with children. So we took Ganymede in, and the barber greeted him. He said, "Oh, but you have lovely hair." Ganymede actually smiled. He seemed to like this man, this barber. So, he willingly allowed himself to be placed on the little booster seat. And the barber covered his shoulders with a smock, and he took his scissors, and he combed through Ganymede's hair, making sure it was perfect in its distribution. He then picked up a small bit of my child's hair, and using the finest scissors that a barber could ever have, cut away about 4 inches from one side of his head. The scream from Ganymede was unworldly. It seemed to echo through that barber shop at 100 decibels. It seemed that it would damage my ears beyond all healing. The lock of shorn golden hair fell to the ground and moved. Instead of falling apart like normal human hair, it clumped together like an animal. It squirmed across the floor looking for some place to hide, someplace safe. It went under the chair. And then I saw, on top of Ganymede's head, at that place where his hair had been cut, the same green liquid that had once issued forth from me. I tried very, very hard to neither vomit nor faint, and succeeded in both. Ganymede jumped from the chair, seeming like an animal, his odd teeth gnashing, his incredibly powerful hands and fingernails slashing. The barber moved away and looked like he had seen something directly from the gates of hell. "What the hell is that thing?" he cried. "What the hell have you brought into my shop? Is that a boy? Is that a monster? Is that some kind of evil thing? I want it out of here. I want it out of here now, or I'm calling the police." Later, as I recollected this conversation, I began to wonder exactly what he would have told the police. Hello, this is Mr. Jackson, the barber down on Walton Street. I need to tell you that there's a demonic child in my barber shop, and that his hair is bleeding green, and that he is strong enough to kill me, I believe. Could you please come and take him away? I'd really appreciate it. The police would have left him out of town. The town would have left him out of town. So what he did was he said, "There's no charge for what we've done today, of course, but please, you need to find another barber. Here is this man who has just seen something that is not entirely human, and even I knew this by this point, and he is asking me simply to find another barber." We took Ganymede home, and once I had him as calm as I could get him, I tried to feed him. I tried lamb and chicken and steak. I tried kidney. I tried liver. But at this point, Ganymede was not eating. It seemed that he simply needed and wanted to sleep. He fell asleep in my lap, one arm very powerfully grasped around my waist, and he stayed that way for the next 24 hours. I was able to get Maxwell to bring me some food, and I simply had to do the best I could in terms of relieving my bladder and other physical necessities. When Ganymede awoke, his hair had healed. That part that had been cut away had regrown. There was a remnant of the green viscous fluid that seemed to exist within his hair. But right now, Ganymede was whole, but he was no longer a sweet child. Well, to be truthful, Ganymede had never been a sweet child, but with the eyes of a mother who loves, I was able to see the sweetness within him. At this point, he began to grow very, very rapidly. By age 7, he was well over 5 feet tall. His hair had changed. Whereas before it seemed relatively like normal human hair, discrete strands coming together where they seemed to hold together through surface tension, but now it was as if they were forming tentacles. It was as if a dozen or 50 or 100 hairs would merge and form something as thick as a soda straw, or a pencil, or maybe just a piece of thick yarn. Our house became a fortress, and I dedicated my entire life to caring for Maxwell. He had never been to school. He had never seen a physician. The only public person he had ever seen was that barber. And that barber closed shop and left town. He was ravenously hungry. It was actually an incredible blessing that Maxwell had as lucrative a job as he did, as we ended up buying extremely large quantities of meat. Tragedy. Yes, tragedy came to visit the Crawley household. And it came in the guise of a liquor bottle. Maxwell, poor Maxwell, I ruined that man's life. I know I did. I'm ashamed of it. There's no way for me to ever make up for it. And Maxwell, for almost 10 years, was the very, very best father a man could be to a being like Ganymede. But that strength that every honorable man believes he has in infinite measure is not at all infinite. And Maxwell began to drink. He began to imbibe. He began to seek comfort in the drunkenness and the oblivion of the bottle. This made me extremely, extremely distressed. I will never forget that day. Maxwell came home from work later than usual, his breath stinking of alcohol. He always had this feral look in his eyes when he had been drinking, and today was no exception. Ganymede spent most of his time in the basement or the attic, or in the place of the house we called his room. He was interested, it seemed, in training his hair. Not training it to lie flat or curly, but to move, to grab things, to gain strength. That was his main activity. He would sit in front of a table and he would concentrate, and his hair would be like 1,000 tiny hands, and it would pick something up, and it would fling it against the wall, and Ganymede would laugh. Most evenings, Ganymede would disappear. We stopped worrying where he had gone, because he was always back in the morning. But there were always signs on telephone poles, and always sad children, and always the question of, where did my dog go? Where did my cat go? Why do these animals have to die so frequently in this area? It was amazing to me that no one ever saw Ganymede when he did his nighttime excursions. But the fear in my heart was, when would the time come when the killing and eating of cats and dogs was simply not adequate for Ganymede any longer? Maxwell came in that night and tore off his belt. He said, "Where is Ganymede? It's time I teach him a lesson. He needs to learn to be a regular boy. Yeah, he may have that hair, but he has to be a boy." He seemed for Ganymede to come downstairs, or upstairs, wherever Ganymede might be hiding. And Ganymede did. He came walking very calmly, very slowly, and he looked at Maxwell and said in that almost reptilian voice, "Yes, what do you want, father?" Maxwell's eyes were insane, and I tried so hard to restrain him. But he took the belt and he hit Ganymede across the face, across the thighs, across the buttocks. Ganymede was surprised. But then there was a hiss. There was a movement like lightning from Ganymede. And the next thing I knew, he was wrapped around Maxwell's head. His tentacles, his hair, had entirely engulfed his face, surrounded his throat. He was suffocating my husband, effortlessly. When my husband would fall, Ganymede would jump to one side and simply look at him. Ganymede was naked. Ganymede never wore clothes. Mostly he wrapped himself in his hair. And honestly, I had not seen him naked in many years. It was an amazing sight. He had arms and legs, but they were incredibly sinuous, incredibly flexible. It was almost as if his joints were no longer really required. Every inch of his body was covered with tiny versions of the golden blonde tentacles that grew from his head, every single inch. He had grown a new plate of armor, or some kind of tough, thickened skin that covered his genitalia. His body was no longer that which one would easily call human. It looked more like a fine, hair-covered statue of sorts. The skin had begun to take on the same blondish golden hue as his astounding living hair. My husband writhed and convulsed for a full 2 minutes or so. He would grasp at Ganymede and try to pull him off, but there was no way once Ganymede's hair had encircled his head and shoulders and skull. Maxwell was, in a word, doomed. I sound so calm to myself right at this moment, but as I think back, I realize that there was a horrible sound in the air, a horrible rending of souls. The sound was my own screaming. Somehow I had disassociated myself from my moment-to-moment existence. So horrible did I find the events of the moment. After Maxwell stopped struggling, Ganymede came away from him, let him go, removed all of his tentacles from Maxwell's body, walked to my side, looked at me with those incredible green eyes, and I saw the first gentleness in them that I had seen in many years, and he stroked my cheek with his tentacle-covered hand. I believe that I went mad. I believe that I actually entered into a realm of maintainable insanity, a place where my brain could protect some part of myself and still allow me to deal with those things that I must deal with, where my mother had raised a child, a daughter, who loved books, who loved learning, who loved adventure. My father had raised an extremely practical daughter, a daughter who was perhaps the ultimate pragmatist. I looked down at Maxwell's body, and I did not exactly understand what I was seeing immediately. He was dead, there's no question of that. I do not believe that his neck was broken, although his head was at a very strange angle. But his hair was all gone, and there were indentations in his skin, as if steaming electrical cords had been placed against his skin, allowed to burn it away, and then immediately pulled away such that the flesh came with it. That's the best I can describe it. There was the green fluid. I think the green fluid is acidic, or at least it can be, when Ganymede needs it to be. You see, I believe Ganymede is an adapter. I believe that whatever his environment requires, he can generate. In this case, he needed to generate some way of killing the man who wanted and wished to be his father, or at least the father of the child that Ganymede might have been many years ago. The question then was, what do I do with Maxwell's body? I had never seen a body in that condition. So, the pragmatist, I simply called the police and said my husband had come home from the field. He was a Halliburton employee and often dealt with toxic chemicals. Had come home from the field in a state that I had never seen another human being in. And would they please come and see if there was any care that could be rendered to him? Well, they did. They heard the harshness and the sadness in my voice from the screaming. They understood that I was bereft. They understood that my world was coming apart. And they came and they found a body that made no sense to them either. Now, in much of the world, when a mystery is encountered, there's a great deal of effort put forth trying to solve that mystery. In southern Texas and in much of Louisiana, the way that mysteries are handled is they are ignored, or they are hidden, or they are swept under the rug, or buried deep, deep, deep in the swamp. I believe I accompanied the police to some central station and gave an account of what I saw when my husband returned from work, but the truth is I'm not entirely sure. My mind was not registering events in the way that one's mind normally does. As they had never seen injuries such as Maxwell had, and I was obviously simply a helpless housewife, they knew that there was no way I had done anything. So there was never an inquiry as to my possible guilt. Ganymede had moved to the attic or to the basement and was nowhere to be found. And then I realized, as that evening progressed, that because of the strange circumstances of Ganymede's birth and the fact that he had never been like any other child, he did not have a birth certificate. I'm not sure there was any record at all of Ganymede existing in the civil system of either Texas or Louisiana. I came home, I suppose, late that evening, or perhaps my brain just kicked back in. Perhaps my brain just reattached itself to the world later that evening. I'm really, really not sure. But I realized that my life, as it had been, was entirely over, and that I could do no more for Ganymede. I loved him. I loved him as any mother loves a child, as any father loves a child. I loved the sweet look I remembered in his eyes, and the promise that he brought to the world. I even loved the thing he had become, though I could not tell you why. I loved that thing simply because it was part of me, and a part of the man who I once called Blazes Boylan. I cogitated, I thought, I examined my mind. Did Blazes bring this pregnancy about deliberately? Did he know that a thing, like Ganymede would be the result of my issue? I have no idea. Somehow I think that Blazes entered my life as a planned event, knowing that simply I had the internal strength to survive this without going totally insane and without committing suicide. I finally fell asleep. The next morning, when I awoke, Ganymede was standing by my side, silently, looking very, very strong. His hair once again was perfect. It had returned to the golden tendrils that it was. It was actually very, very beautiful. And I realized at that point that he had grown, probably 6 to 8 inches, overnight. I have no idea how that happened. And since I had become extremely comfortable with the fact that Ganymede was not entirely human, I did not worry. After all, I did not know the biological realities of rare creatures. I also realized that I was hearing Ganymede's voice, but that his mouth was not moving. He seemed to be speaking directly into my mind. Well, that didn't seem to surprise me a great deal either. Nothing about Ganymede at this point seemed to be very surprising at all. He told me in a voice that sounded more like a little boy than any voice I had ever heard from him, that he would have to leave. He had to go someplace where he could be safe, where he could grow, where he could become, over time, what he was supposed to be. He asked for my help in that. I told him I would help him any way I could. So we gathered together the few things that he loved. A book here, a seashell there, those tiny things of the world that boys collect, and girls, but they're different. And that evening, under the cover of darkness, Ganymede and I entered our 1959 Ford Country sedan. It was an absolute boat of a car, and Ganymede had all manner of places where he could lie down, or sit down, or hide, where nobody passing by would ever see him. We drove north. We drove to the big thicket. We looked around. We saw the trees, the hardwoods, the swamp. We saw those streams, but there were too many people there, too many signs of civilization. So we drove farther north, up to the Davy Crockett National Forest, past Lufkin. It was an area where one could easily find virgin forest that no man had ever really spent much time perusing. I must admit there was a part of me that was afraid to put my arms around Ganymede. I did not know exactly what would happen, and then I realized that if I did not hug my boy goodbye, if I did not show him that bit of affection, that the horror of the evening would continue for the rest of my life. I walked toward Ganymede once he got out of the car, and I put my arms around him. I told him I loved him. I told him I'm sorry that I could not make more for him. I could not make the world a better place for him. That I did not better understand what he was. Of course, I didn't need to put these in words. He could hear them in his mind, and I could hear what was in his mind. He said, in his mind, "You did what you had to do." I suppose the emotion that I felt was love, coming from him, maybe gratitude, maybe something entirely different from what humans feel, as Ganymede is not entirely human. But then I watched him almost glide into the trees. I saw him stand next to a large tree. I saw his tendrils reach out, wrap around the bark, and then I sat in the huge station wagon for several hours, running the engine, running the air conditioner, grateful for the fact that it had a powerful V8 engine, grateful for the fact that the air conditioner worked so well. I suppose a part of me thought that Ganymede might return, might come back to say one last thing, to wave, to give me a small smile, or to tell me when I might see him again. What I heard in my mind, though, was, "Go home. Just go home. I will be fine. I will let you know that I'm alive from time to time." About once a year, for many years, around the time of his birthday, I would feel a tingling in my skull, an awareness that Ganymede was somehow letting me know he was alive. It was not all that different from the glow I felt in my belly when I knew my body was ready to bring new life into the world. It was something I could not control. It was something I did not ask for. But still, there was a certain peace and happiness in understanding that Ganymede was out there somewhere, making the world that he needed to be in. How he survived, I have no idea. For a number of years, I would read the papers and ask people questions about that part of the world. And indeed, there were animals that went missing. There were people that went missing. There were parts of the forest that people considered to be haunted. There were parts of the forest that people absolutely were told not to camp in. Not because of some proto-human, hair-covered creature of incredible strength and will, but because of the haints, because of the ghosts. I knew better. It's been about 10 years now since I felt that tingle in my brain. I always thought that perhaps I would open the door and I would see something indicating that Ganymede had returned home, although I doubt very much that he would come in and present himself to me as my son. I always got the feeling that as he became less and less human, there actually was tremendous danger in being around him. He was the new Superman. He was a being that had never existed before, or at least I don't believe he had. And he had to make a way in the world. And I am not at all certain that Blazes Boylan did not go from town to town, seeking young women of a particular appearance and a particular personality, with whom he could leave the seed of the new expression of truly savage humanity.
Okay, it's time for all the formal ending stuff. Trailer Trash Terrors is written and produced by me, Vic Hermanson, with help from Boudreaux, of course. The music you heard was provided by Loco Lobo and Smart Sound. Our social media presence will be expanded in the next few weeks, but for now, if you want to get in touch with us, please just write to trailertrashterrors@gmail.com. We need your stories. As you can see, we are just a wee bit different here. If you have a story that you have thought is too odd to share anywhere else, please call us. Please send it to us. We want it, we need it, and we will present it with respect and understanding. Thanks again.